When the INFJ stops expecting anyone to meet their depth, something quietly magical happens inside them. It doesn't arrive with fireworks. It comes as a slow, almost imperceptible internal shift. For most INFJs, life has long been lived with an unspoken hope humming beneath every relationship. The hope that someone, someday, will finally see all of them, understand them without translation, and meet them in the vast inner world where meaning, intuition, emotion, and vision intertwine. This hope shapes how they love, how they listen, how they give, and how much of themselves they pour into others. When that expectation dissolves, the INFJ does not become colder or detached. They become clearer. For a long time, the INFJ has been carrying a quiet ache. Not the kind that screams, but the kind that lingers. They often sense life in layers, emotional undertones, symbolic meanings, future implications, and they naturally assume that if they feel things this deeply, others must be capable of meeting them there. So they offer depth as an invitation. They listen intensely, read between the lines, remember small details, and show up emotionally in ways that feel almost sacred to them. Unconsciously, they hope that this level of presence will be reciprocated, not necessarily in identical form, but in essence. When it isn't, the INFJ often internalizes the disappointment, wondering if they asked for too much, if they were too intense, too complex, too unseen. If you're ready to unlock your full INFJ potential, check out the INFJ Purpose Compass today. The link is in the description of this video. When the INFJ stops expecting others to meet their depth, the first thing that happens is grief. There's a quiet mourning for the fantasy of mutuality they have carried for years. It is the letting go of an imagined connection that never quite materialized. This grief is not bitter, it is tender. It's the realization that most people are not unwilling, but unable to inhabit the emotional and psychological terrain the INFJ lives in daily. Accepting this truth hurts, because it dismantles the belief that depth alone guarantees relationship. But it also liberates the INFJ from an exhausting cycle of hope and disappointment. As this acceptance settles in, the INFJ's energy begins to return to them. For years, much of it was spent reaching, translating, adjusting, and overgiving in an attempt to bridge an invisible gap. They were often the ones holding space, doing emotional labor, and carrying conversations into deeper waters, while others floated comfortably at the surface. Without the expectation of being met, the INFJ no longer feels compelled to perform emotional depth for validation. They stop explaining themselves endlessly. They stop shrinking or overextending just to keep others engaged. Their presence becomes quieter but more grounded, less urgent, less strained. This shift radically changes how the INFJ relates to people. They become more discerning without becoming judgmental. Instead of unconsciously asking, "Will this person understand me?" they ask, "Is this relationship nourishing as it is?" They no longer force intimacy where it does not naturally arise. Shallow interactions stop feeling like personal failures and start feeling like neutral realities. The INFJ learns to enjoy people for who they are, not who they hoped they could be. This acceptance removes resentment from their relationships, because resentment often comes from unspoken expectations that go unmet. Emotionally, the INFJ becomes steadier. When they stop expecting others to meet their depth, they also stop outsourcing their sense of being seen. They realize that being understood is meaningful, but being self-aligned is essential. Their inner world becomes a place of refuge rather than a lonely fortress. They turn inward, not out of withdrawal, but out of self-respect. Journaling deepens. Creativity becomes more authentic. Solitude feels rich instead of compensatory. They begin to validate their own perceptions rather than constantly checking them against others' reactions. There is also a profound change in how the INFJ loves. Love becomes less sacrificial and more intentional. Instead of giving endlessly in hopes of emotional reciprocity, they give from abundance. They still care deeply. This does not disappear, but they stop confusing intensity with intimacy. They allow people to love them in the ways they are capable of, without demanding emotional fluency they do not possess. At the same time, the INFJ becomes more protective of their inner life. Access to their depth is no longer granted by default. It is earned through consistency, curiosity, and emotional maturity. Interestingly, this is often when the INFJ becomes most magnetic. There is a calm confidence that emerges when they are no longer seeking to be understood at all costs. Their depth becomes quieter, less performative, and paradoxically more powerful. They stop chasing resonance and start embodying it. Some people drift away because they were accustomed to the INFJ doing all the emotional work. Others step closer, sensing a grounded presence that does not beg to be seen, but simply is. The INFJ also gains clarity about loneliness. They realize that loneliness is not the absence of people, but the absence of authenticity. By releasing unrealistic expectations, they stop feeling lonely in rooms full of people and stop idealizing connections that only exist in potential. They learn that it is better to be alone than to be perpetually misunderstood in close proximity to others. This does not make them isolated. It makes them honest. On a deeper level, this shift marks a kind of emotional adulthood for the INFJ. They accept that depth is not a universal currency. Not everyone is meant to access them fully, and not every connection needs to reach existential levels to be valid. This maturity allows them to move through the world with less friction. They stop fighting reality and start working with it. They become less reactive, less wounded by others' limitations, and more anchored in their own truth. When the INFJ stops expecting anyone to meet their depth, they don't become less deep. They become less burdened. Their inner world remains vast, symbolic, and emotionally rich, but it is no longer something they constantly try to hand over to others in hopes of recognition. It becomes something they inhabit fully, something that informs their choices, boundaries, and purpose. In this new phase, the INFJ's relationship with meaning itself begins to change. Where they once searched for meaning through connection, through being mirrored, understood, and emotionally met, they now begin to generate meaning from alignment. Life stops being about whether others get it and starts being about whether their actions, values, and inner compass are in harmony. This shift is subtle but profound. Decisions feel cleaner. Regret loses its grip. The INFJ no longer second-guesses their intuition simply because it isn't validated externally. What once needed confirmation now stands on its own. This inner realignment also transforms how the INFJ handles disappointment. Previously, unmet depth often felt personal, even existential. It could shake their faith in humanity or reinforce the sense of being fundamentally different or out of place. Now, disappointment is contextual rather than consuming. They see emotional limitations as situational, not as betrayals. This allows them to recover faster, without withdrawing completely or building emotional walls. Their heart remains open, but it is no longer exposed. Another quiet transformation occurs in the INFJ's sense of power. When they stop expecting others to meet their depth, they reclaim agency over their emotional world. They realize how much influence they've been giving away, waiting for others to respond a certain way before feeling settled, inspired, or whole. That dependency dissolves. Their emotional state becomes less reactive to external inconsistency. This does not make them indifferent. It makes them sovereign. They can sit with complexity without needing immediate resonance, and that steadiness becomes a source of strength. The INFJ also becomes far more honest with themselves about timing. They begin to understand that depth is not only about capacity, but about readiness. Some people may one day meet them in ways they cannot right now. This insight softens the INFJ's tendency toward final judgments and emotional door slamming. Instead of cutting people off in silent grief, they create flexible boundaries that honor the present without erasing the future. This nuance brings peace where there was once emotional finality. Creatively and intellectually, the INFJ often enters a renaissance. Without the constant outward projection of their inner world, it begins to crystallize into form. Ideas become sharper. Writing, teaching, mentoring, or creating takes on a more distilled quality. They are no longer trying to translate themselves for comprehension. They're expressing themselves for truth. This often leads to work that feels more impactful, even if it reaches fewer people. The INFJ realizes that resonance matters more than reach. There's also a noticeable shift in how the INFJ experiences empathy. Empathy becomes less self-erasing. They no longer absorb others' emotions in an attempt to connect deeply enough to be understood in return. Instead, empathy becomes observational, compassionate, and bounded. They can care without collapsing into others' emotional worlds. This preserves their energy and prevents the quiet burnout that once followed prolonged closeness. Spiritually, many INFJs experience a deepening rather than a crisis. Letting go of expectations strips away illusions, and in that emptiness, something truer emerges. They begin to trust the unseen processes of life rather than forcing alignment through effort. Patience grows. Faith becomes less about hope for connection and more about trust in unfolding. Even solitude takes on a sacred quality, no longer as a placeholder, but as a meaningful state of being. The INFJ's self-respect also solidifies. They stop negotiating their worth through emotional access. They no longer over-explain their depth or apologize for it. It simply exists. This self-respect subtly reshapes every interaction. People sense it. Some respond with greater care. Others fade naturally. The INFJ no longer chases or resents either outcome. As this grounded presence stabilizes, the INFJ's relationship with time begins to shift. They become less hurried emotionally, less driven by the urgency to find their people or reach a relational destination that promises fulfillment. Time is no longer experienced as something slipping away while they wait to be understood. Instead, it becomes spacious. They trust that what is aligned does not need to be chased, and what requires forcing is not meant to last. This patience brings a sense of calm that permeates their daily life, from how they plan their future to how they sit with uncertainty. The INFJ also starts to experience a surprising lightness in communication. Conversations no longer carry the invisible weight of expectation. They speak when they feel moved to, not when they feel obligated to deepen the exchange. Silence becomes comfortable rather than awkward or loaded. They stop feeling responsible for elevating every interaction into something meaningful. This allows their words to land more cleanly, and when they do choose to share something profound, it is offered freely rather than as a bid for connection. Another new development is the INFJ's changing relationship with anger. Previously, anger was often suppressed, transformed into sadness, or turned inward as self-blame. When expectations dissolve, anger becomes clearer and healthier. They recognize when boundaries have been crossed without needing to intellectualize or spiritualize the violation. This clarity allows them to respond rather than absorb. Anger becomes a signal, not a storm, and it helps them protect their inner world without losing compassion. The INFJ's sense of identity also sharpens. Without the constant mirroring of others to define their emotional reality, they gain a more stable sense of who they are across contexts. They are no longer one version of themselves in solitude and another in relationship. This internal consistency reduces the exhaustion that comes from subtle self-editing. They feel more whole, more integrated, as if the inner and outer selves have finally stopped negotiating and started cooperating. The INFJ also often redefines success. Success no longer looks like being deeply known by many or emotionally indispensable to others. It looks like living in integrity with their values, protecting their energy, and contributing meaning without self-erasure. They begin to prioritize sustainability over intensity. This shift often leads them to make bold, quiet changes, leaving draining environments, simplifying commitments, or choosing paths that feel truer even if they are less impressive on the surface. As time goes on, a deep, unshakable peace begins to emerge. Not happiness in the conventional sense, but a steady inner stillness. The INFJ is no longer at war with the world for not meeting them where they live. They understand that depth is their nature, not a debt others owe them. And in releasing that expectation, they find themselves standing firmly in their own life, present, self-trusting, and no longer waiting for permission to be whole.